welcome to the first instalment of the Real Inclusion podcast, a podcast for employers who value inclusion and want to get it right. In this podcast, we have Dr. Sally Witcher, OBE, Chair of the Scottish Commission on Social Security, and Rani, Head of Employee Advocacy at Adobe. They discuss disability in the workplace and beyond, and share their experiences for others. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Sally Witcher. My career path has been a somewhat strange route. My first degree was in fine art, making mixed media installations and having exhibitions. And I was chief executive of a non-profit called Child Poverty Action Group working around child poverty. Went into academia, have been a senior civil servant in the Westminster government, a consultant, done a lot of work around wider equality issues, and came into this role in 2013 at a point in time where Inclusion Scotland consisted of 5 people. I have been a disabled person since early childhood, but I clearly have been interested in a lot of things and have not allowed the fact that I'm a disabled person to define my identity. But that said, I am perfectly proud to identify as a disabled person and see no shame in that whatsoever.
And I'm Rani. I lead employee advocacy at Adobe. My background is in psychology, and I have a master's in international business. And I thought I would originally go down the nonprofit route of serving in different countries and in different capacities. I've just always known that to give is really what life is all about. And I have a huge belief that the person who helps the most wins. And so always been someone to lead with the heart. And I've had an incredible opportunity to go and serve in Calcutta, India with Mother Teresa for a year. And through doing that, she told me not to think about serving solely without the business background as well. And so she chased me out of India and told me to go back to the States and finish my education and make as much money as possible and try to infect and influence in corporate America. And so that is my calling in life. And her biggest counsel to me is your heart and your mind are not mutually exclusive. They're both attached to the same body. And so you can actually leverage both. I happen to be a disabled person as well. I was born with cerebral palsy, but it happens to be one facet of many things that make me up.
How you understand what it is that disables a person who has an impairment of some kind. You can take a stance which says what disables a person who has an impairment is the impairment. So, for example, somebody like me, I use a wheelchair. Is the reason I can't get into the building that has stairs up the front because I'm in a wheelchair? Alternatively, you could say, well, why don't they just stick a ramp in? Because then I could get in. And it's the fact there isn't a ramp that is what effectively disables me. Because if the attitudes are right, people aren't making wrong assumptions about you, because that can disable you. If you don't get a job because people assume you can't do it, you're pretty disabled by that, regardless of whether you can do the job. So in the workplace, for example, it may be quite possible for somebody who, say, has an impairment that means they have less energy in the morning. Perhaps it's completely unnecessary for that person to start at 9 o'clock in the morning. It really doesn't make any substantive difference to that job or their ability to do it. But if you change the way it's organised, that person can do the job. And so it's about the positive message of the social model is there are things that employers, in fact, everyone can do to remove those barriers and stop people who have impairments from experiencing that disadvantage. Because if you change the way you do things, then that person is going to be able to operate on an equal basis.
When I think of someone who is not born disabled, like I was born disabled, versus someone who may have been injured or fall upon an illness, as a society, we tend to make all sorts of pivots for that, for the latter, right? And I think it absolutely fits this model that you're talking about. And we don't see it as a model because it seems like the most natural and humane thing to do, right? To accommodate and to leverage that person's true skill. They're temporarily challenged. And so, what do we as an environment and a society need to do to still bring forth the goodness that they bring, right? But somehow that narrative changes dramatically when a person is born with an impairment. Then it seems like, well, why should I have to accommodate? And, you're actually infringing on my rights. And I just think it's fascinating how there's such a completely different treatment plan, whether they're born disabled versus if you happen to fall into.
That's very interesting. I've never really thought about it as being different for somebody who was born with an impairment to somebody who acquires one later on. But the central point I think that you're talking about is absolutely right. It's about, do you or does society expect people to fit in with it and the way it does things? So it's the person that needs to find ways of adjusting as best they can. Or is it about society thinking about what it can do to change the way it operates and its cultural messages and so on as well, to accommodate much more people just as standard practice? And very often in the employment field, it's about quite creative thinking. So they may be able to do an extremely good job, but they may do it in a very different way. My experience of discrimination is most, if not all of it, is not done on purpose. People don't set out to build buildings that I can't get into. But if you don't live it, if it's not part of your life, and if you're just used to people being able to do things in one way, sometimes you just don't see it. From my personal experience, if I can just quote the kind of example I experienced as a disabled chief executive, I may be going to speak to a very senior person in government or being examined by a committee in the parliament about something complex around, say, social security legislation. And then I'll come out of the parliament and go to get into a taxi, and the taxi driver won't speak to me. They'll speak to my PA, the person who supports me, and ask, where does she want to go?
It's true, Sally, and you bring up such interesting and important points. People don't set out to exclude or discriminate or hurt feelings. When you know better, you do better, right? And I feel like a lot of people may not have the exposure to disability in their life, and there's a discomfort and an awkwardness and wanting to be politically correct. People then overcompensate by being even more awkward. When I first hired on at IBM, I was very much an older white male, right? And so I remember a gentleman walking up to me and speaking very methodically and slowly and enunciating his words, because he just assumed that physical disability, matched the fact that somehow you were slower in comprehending. And it was so startling, but I found it so humorous. And I just asked him if he was okay. And we had a good laugh, and I was able to educate, and we moved on from there, right?
Yes.
And so taking those moments and just assuming good intent, right? The other thing, though, I wanted to bring up, Sally, is this notion of disabled people representing our lived experiences. As you know as well, there are no two disabilities that are alike, right? I worry about disabled people representing all of disability. There might be 100 people in this room with cerebral palsy, and my experience might be very different from everybody else's. And I don't feel qualified to speak on behalf of the entire community. And so that's why it's neat to know that there's so many of us and so many different voices. When I think of 1 in 4 Americans being disabled, that's quite a huge population. We can all bring something to the table, but nothing we say is all encompassing.
I think you're right. I think, again, that's why a social model kind of approach can sometimes be quite helpful, because it's about drawing people's attention to the kinds of barriers that can get in the way. So say something like there not being a ramp some wheelchair users can get in. I could be pretty confident that not having a ramp is going to be an issue for an awful lot of wheelchair users. It isn't just that we all have different forms of impairments. We have many, many other characteristics as well, and many different life experiences and roles. And I think, again, that's something which I sometimes find a little bit frustrating, is I've found in my career that somehow people expect that if I can talk about anything with authority, it will be disability. So when I was a senior civil servant, I would be in meetings with colleagues who didn't know me, and we'd be maybe talking about things like, I don't know, program management or organizational restructuring or those kinds of things. And you would see people's faces when I started talking about things which weren't disability. And it was generally a double take. It was like, ooh, just the mere fact that I was sat down rather than stood up seemed to me that they stopped talking to me. People would ask the person I was with. And I don't think I ever experienced that before, but it was so noticeable. And I've seen how for example, when I started using a wheelchair, which I didn't use for a long time, how people's attitudes towards me changed. It's always about, if you have a disabled employee, you don't make assumptions. I wouldn't make assumptions. I'm the chief executive of an organisation which employs a lot of disabled people with all manner of different impairments. But I have some general kinds of approaches. Maybe I know more about the right questions to ask, even if I don't always know the answers.
And, it's so fascinating to me, Sally, that you would mention the assumption that people have that you should be a foremost authority in the field of disability, because if there's something that I'm the least qualified to talk about, and I mean that in the most sincere way, just like I'm the least qualified to talk about being an Indian. I often joke with my friends that I am the fakest Indian that you will ever come across, right? I happen to have Indian features and I have Indian parents, but I was born and raised here in the US, and I very much identify as an American. Not that I don't love the Indian culture and the Indian food and language and everything else, but I am embarrassingly unknowledgeable about India in the way that people give me credit for, right? Similarly, with disability, because for whatever reason, my approach to it has been, it is one of many dimensions that make me up into being the multi-passionate individual that I am. But the other point I want to make is this notion of accommodations for disability. I just wonder if we were to reframe it as differences actually engender innovation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whether it be disability, whether it be age, right? Whether it be diversity and ethnicity, sexual orientation, whatever it is, right? All those differences tend to accelerate innovation. So if we could somehow change the narrative so that employers can consider how can elevating the voices of all these underrepresented communities help us accelerate innovation, which will ultimately improve our bottom line, as opposed to how do I need to accommodate this individual? So somebody who's disabled who needs to work alone or not come into the office as much or as early. That could be the case for any number of people, right? Who have sleep apnea or whatever it is, right? Or you're a working mom and you need to be able to bring your kids to school first. Or so why not think about it as flexible hours that would actually help us realize the potential of our entire workforce versus, oh, here's this one thing I'm doing for Sally and Rani.
No, I agree. And the more you can, in our language, I suppose we talk about it mainstreaming equality. It means that you don't feel singled out, and it means you don't feel, inverted commas, kind of special. And the other point here that you've made very well, I thought, I completely agree. It's about the value of diversity. And I talked earlier on about, people being able to do equally as good, sometimes even a better job, but do it in a different way to the way that people might expect. And that is how you get creativity. That is how you bring innovation. And if you think about it, if you have a problem and you have many different people with many different perspectives looking to solve it, you're going to get it looked at from all kinds of angles. And that means you're going to come up with better solutions because it's been tested out. And that's how you breed innovation.
We've got some designers within our Access at Adobe group at Adobe. So this is our employee network that looks at the needs of the employee community with disabilities, both invisible and visible. And those designers are inclusive designers. And they will say when they actually design with inclusion in mind and the perspective of different things, whether it be disability or anything, but in this case, specifically disability, how they actually design superior products and research back that up, right?
Yes.
Like if you actually, with your workforce, mirror the population that you're serving, then chances are you're going to have a built-in focus group for what your market is desiring.
I'm not sure all employers, in fact, society necessarily, their starting point is to see it in that way. There's quite a gap, perhaps, to go between the kinds of approaches you're talking about and I've been talking about with you, when you've got a culture that perhaps still sees disabled people as kind of objects of pity, that poor things need to be looked after, that can't do things for themselves, and possibly sometimes of inspiration, but not necessarily for the right reasons. Maybe if I just draw another personal anecdote, I had some total stranger come up to me on a train going to a meeting, sitting there minding my own business, and this woman came up to me and just said, "I just want you to know, I think you're very brave." And I thought, why? I'm just sat here on the train going to work. It was really telling me more about her low expectations of what somebody like me could do than the fact that I'd done something extraordinary. And it actually felt very uncomfortable for me. And I don't know if you've come across, there's a term that sometimes gets used in our world, which is inspiration porn. The idea where people actually kind of feel good about themselves because of other people being objects of pity or charity. We're just normal people. We're just trying to get on with our lives like everybody else.
I know these folks are so well intentioned, right? They mean paying you a compliment. And so when I've come across that, I take it for the compliment that it is, but then I do try to use that time to educate. If you think me sitting on a train is inspirational, come into my home with my 4 children, right? Or whatever it is, things that just blow their mind.
This isn't about kind of beating people up if they get it wrong. It absolutely isn't about that. It's about supporting people feeling safe to ask questions and maybe to kind of, not feel embarrassed if they got it a bit wrong. You've got to get people to engage first off, whether they engage in a good way or a bad way. It's the beginning of a conversation, potentially. Nobody wants to get it wrong, and sometimes it's the fear of that stops people from even trying. And that's what you've somehow got to try and diffuse.
That's exactly right. And I'd so much rather have somebody try and get it wrong than not try at all, because there's a lot of people that are apathetic, right? Because they're so paralyzed with fear, they don't even attempt. From an employer standpoint, my personal thing is that the first thing that you do is actually interview or source from a community that is inclusive of disabled people, because I find that's where it starts going wrong, really wrong, is you have job openings, but then the places that you go to actually source candidates are not at all inclusive of any sort of disability. So if you're not even casting a net in an ocean that is representative of disabled people, then you're not going to even. So that's where the approach needs to be different, in that you have diverse hiring practices, right? And then as colleagues, I would say, in your well-intentioned desires, right, to be my buddy and colleague, do not take choice away from me, right? So when we go into a conference room, don't assume I want to take that first seat because it's closest to the door, and then awkwardly suggest I sit there. Afford me choice.
I would say, whether it's employers, policymakers, strangers on the train, whoever it happens to be, there's probably a bit of a formula here, which goes something along the lines of: don't assume, ask, listen, learn, and then act. Because if you're trying to make policy that works for everybody, that applies. If you're an employer, that applies. And it's probably, again, a good formula, not just when you're interacting with a visibly disabled person, but actually with anyone. We're all very different. We all have different things that are visible and things that are not visible. And the things that are visible may or may not tell you about who that person is. It's about giving the person the right to define their own needs and aspirations. And then if there's one other thing, it's about understanding how this is going to lead, this approach, to better business, better products, and better policy.
One other parting thought that I want to leave here with is I am so convinced that the way you think about yourself and project yourself is just everything, right? People take a cue from your own sense of yourself. And, when I walk into a room, I own that room, right? I genuinely believe I'm unstoppable. And so therefore, people, woe is them should they try to speak down to me. And this is true for anyone, right? It's not just a matter of disability. I just find that any individual who has confidence and walks in owning who they are, you're treated differently.
People aren't necessarily vulnerable intrinsically, but they can be rendered vulnerable by things not accommodating them, by services not being there that they need. But it's not inevitable that people are vulnerable. It's not inevitable that people who have impairments experience disability and inequality, because there are changes that can be made to the way the world works, by the way people's attitudes, the environment, that means that people can have an impairment but not experience inequality and disability because of it, but can just be part and parcel of the mainstream. And there's a real appreciation that we are normal people, as normal and as varied and diverse as everybody else, and that is a good, positive, creative thing.
I think of innovation, creativity. I think of resilience and grit and strength. I do think of unreasonableness, right? From the standpoint of the George Bernard Shaw quote, right? About the reasonable man adapts himself to the world, the unreasonable man demands that the world adapt to them. This notion of demanding what's needed, right? And unreasonableness in the strongest, boldest sense.
I'd like to get to a point where it isn't about discussing disability, because actually there's nothing to discuss, because we're all just part and parcel of everything, and it's all understood, and that people aren't making assumptions, and it's just standard practice that you check in with people and that those barriers are removed just as standard practice.